African history, European activities in Africa. European activities in Africa. For quite some time many Europeans knew about the existence of the African continent, but little did they know about the details of the interior. It is for this reason, therefore, that they often referred to Africa as dark continent. During the 19th century, however, there were efforts by the Royal Geographical Society, several European governments as well as religious groups to solve the mystery surrounding the dark continent. It is true that the Europeans had known the existence of large rivers draining into the oceans, but did not know their sources like River Nile, the Congo, Zambezi and the Gambia Volta in West Africa. Much of the first half of the 19th century was spent on the exploration of the continent. Africa was invaded from all angles in search of sources of rivers and more knowledge about the interior. In essence, therefore, the period between 1800 and 1880 can be regarded as a period of exploration of Africa by Europeans. The exploration was carried out by the explorers who traversed the continent in search of information about Africa. It is these explorers and from their writings that opened the eyes of Europe to Africa. In a bid to solve the mystery of the Nile, various explorers came to Africa. Between 1840 and 1873, Dr. David Livingstone travelled from the Cape deep into Central and East Africa in search for the source of the Nile. Although he did not succeed, his travels and articles written about Central and East Africa. David Livingstone explored the Zambezi Basin, Nyasaland and Tanganyika. Why Africa was not colonized before 1880. Africa was still regarded as a white man's grave due to the tropical diseases, especially malaria. The discovery of quinine in 1857 reduced the risks of malaria that made many Europeans to come to Africa in large numbers. Before 1880, many Europeans still regarded the African continent as a dark continent, like the British wanted commercial expansion in Africa without colonial expansion, as they expected no better life in Africa. Negative attitude towards colonies, like the British had colonies in Canada and Australia which they found out expensive and quite troublesome. Britain found out that colonies were unnecessary and burdensome to the British taxpayers. Similarly, Bismarck of Germany, after annexing Alsace and Lorraine in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War, which were rich French territories, found out that there was no need to acquire more colonies in Africa. It was against this background that Bismarck remarked, "My map of Africa is in Europe." He believed that colonies were not worthy the bones of even a single German soldier. It was because of these reasons that Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, did not participate in the scramble drama until after the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, which determined the colonial position of Africa. Some European powers were interested in colonizing other parts of the world, like Britain was more interested in her commercial empire of India. It was still busy trying to exploit Canada and Australia until the two got their independence in the late 18th century. The real state of European industrialization came after 1880, when many powers began to expand their manufacturing sector, trying to end the British monopoly for the market of manufactured goods and wanted to compete with her for sources of raw materials from Africa. I.e., there was parallelism in the commercial activities between Europeans and Africans. Every European nation competed for colonies, as most of them were depending on Britain for manufactured goods. Many European powers were involved in internal political problems, like Germany and Italy did not become united until 1870s. On top of this, there was a strong war in 1870-71 periods between Germany and France called the Franco-Prussian War, where France lost her territories of Alsace and Lorraine. Therefore, France had to keep time planning a war of revenge against the Germans, hence delaying her participation in scramble and partition. There was relative stability because of power in Europe before 1880. After the Franco-Prussian War, there occurred political imbalance in the whole world. Countries no longer respected the interests of Britain and France. Britain used to be a sea master while France a land master. But by 1880, the two had lost this pride, which made many Europeans to come in Africa for competition for economic opportunities, hence scramble and partition of Africa. Men on spot imperialists had not acquired a favourable operational atmosphere until 1880. After 1880, European powers which were seeking economic opportunities hoped to exploit from Africa. They had to sponsor and protect African history, European activities in Africa. The imperialists carved out colonies for political glory and economic gains, like Belgium supported Leopold to acquire Congo. France had to support de Brazza to bring part of northern Congo under its control, although it was a flop. Gerald Portal had to be supported to come to Uganda. Cecil Rhodes had to be supported in his South African activities. Hostility of Africans. The hostility of Africans who had relatively more physical strength scared Europeans before 1880s. Africans were well organized, and some states had organized armies capable of resisting the colonial penetration. To countercheck this hostility, European colonizers had to first send humanitarians like missionaries to soften their resisting hearts. Many missionary groups had to come to Africa after 1880 and before. The discovery of minerals in South Africa. By 1880, minerals had been discovered at Kimberley. Copper, uranium, and iron ore were also discovered in the process. By 1886, gold was discovered at Witwatersrand. Rumours for more mineral prospects in Katanga-Congo zone spread like wildfire, all of which made the scramble for colonies inevitable. The British occupation of Egypt in 1882. Although France had the greatest assets and the greatest number of foreigners in Egypt, the British, after crushing the Urubist revolt, declared Egypt as their colony, hence cheating France. This annoyed France, which was the rightful country to colonize Egypt. It is out of this challenge that France had to go and occupy a number of territories in West Africa in a bid to compensate the 1882 loss of Egypt. This incited other colonial powers like Portugal, Germany, and Italy to come for territories in Africa, hence making the period after 1880 climax into scramble and partition of Africa. Therefore, for different reasons, European powers did not enter scramble and partition of Africa until 1880. It was after 1880 that change of opinion in the Europe influenced many European powers to rush for colonies, which culminated into the loss of independence by many African states. Why was Africa partitioned after 1880? Officially 1884. Causes of the scramble and partition of Africa. A summary of economic or commercial considerations. Hobson's view. Industrial revolution and its effects as need for raw materials, need for market, need for employment, settle population, need to invest capital, mineral discovery in South Africa, economic depression, conducive climate, fertile soils. Be social/humanitarian/philanthropic. Victor Carrington and Cohen. Need to spread Christianity, need to wipe out Islam, to abolish slavery, to end barbaric African practices, to promote formal education, the theory of racial Darwinism. See political factors. J.P. Taylor. Imbalance of power in Europe, rise of nationalism and development of jingoism, European political and social superiority over African race, Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, African history, European activities in Africa, 1884–85. These strategic factors. John Gallagher and Robinson Robert. British occupation of Egypt, British occupation of Sudan, British occupation of Uganda, British occupation of Kenya, Zanzibar, Leopold XI and French occupation of Congo, British and French occupation of Niger Delta, British and Gold Coast, French Senegal, British occupation at the Cape Africa, French/Italians occupation of Maghreb region, Italian, Somaliland, Eritrea. E. Role of the press. F. European public opinion. G. Arms race. H. Role of men on spot. Causes of scramble and partition in details. From the political point of view, many changes had taken place on the political scene of Europe, which changes favoured colonial possessions or which forced European powers to acquire or struggle for colonies. In the first instance, Europe had overcome most of its political problems. The continent had been rid of the anarchists, those who had jeopardized European peace and tranquility, the likes of Napoleon Bonaparte, Metternich, European monarchs, and others. In their place, there rose new men of imperial ambition such as Salisbury, Bismarck, etc. According to A. J. P. Taylor in his book The Mastery of Europe, he argued that it was because of the forces of nationalism that nations acquired territories. Between 1880 and 1900, European nations competed with one another to become world powers. By 1879, France had got political stability and was now in position to extend her political sovereignty. Italy and Germany had got unified respectively. The unifications of Germany and Italian states and the emergency of strong nations that desired to be glorified had pushed them into the colonial arena. The competition of the unifications meant that there was no more room and territories in Europe for colonizing. This partly explains why the European powers turned to Africa. The unifications of Italy and Germany had led to the French loss of Alsace and Lorraine, which were rich in coal and iron. This drove the French crazy to look for territories/colonies elsewhere for compensation. It is imperative to note also that the second half of the 19th century was an era of empire building when men strove to die for the sake of expanding their home empires. The likes of Karl Peters, Captain Lugard, Cecil Rhodes, Lord Kitchener. It is also argued that European powers struggled for colonies with a motive of balance of power. It was after British acquisition of Egypt in 1882 that other European powers also rushed to have colonies. France struggled for colonies in West Africa because she wished to maintain the balance of power, having lost Alsace and Lorraine to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War. The calling and conclusion of the 1884–85, chaired by Otto von Bismarck, the then Chancellor of Germany, the European powers agreed on the principle of effective occupation, which replaced the Hinterland theory. The principle of effective occupation then sent European powers wild in search and annexation of territories because African history, European activities in Africa. In the first instance, by the mid-19th century there was spread of the Industrial Revolution from Britain to the continental Europe, i.e. Portugal, Spain, France, Austria, etc., that created economic situations that necessitated colonial possessions. With many industries throughout Europe producing similar commodities, European powers demanded for raw materials for these industries in Europe. For example, cotton in East and North Africa, palm oil and cocoa from West Africa, ivory from East, Central and West Africa, tin, gold, copper from East, Central and West Africa, indigo from West Africa. Furthermore, during the 1880s many European powers suffered widespread unemployment partly because of the invention of machines and partly because of increased population. In a bid to solve the unemployment problem, European powers were forced to acquire colonies to secure employment for their people. This explains why European powers established settler colonies. In Britain, there were over 1 million unemployed. Britain established northern and southern Rhodesia. France established in Algeria, while Germans encouraged settler communities in Namibia and southern highlands of Tanganyika. The Portuguese also established settler communities in Mozambique and Angola. African territories also provided market for the finished goods like cloth, beads, alcohol, plates, cups, etc. Another economic factor was the discovery of valuable minerals in southern Africa. Diamonds in Griqualand, West Kimberley in 1867 and gold in Witwatersrand in 1886. This discovery created an impression that the whole of the African basement rock contained minerals. This drove the European powers crazy for African territories, hoping to acquire the fortunate in mining. They also wanted to invest abroad the surplus income/capital because there was no more accumulation of profits in European areas. Britain was the leading industrial power and was joined by other European countries like France, Germany, and Italy, which were at a young stage of development and faced with several problems. Britain could offer high prices of raw materials and also offered quality, cheap finished goods, hence there was stiff competition. Therefore there was need to acquire and protect colonies in order to raise profits. Hence, Europeans took over colonies as assets and contributed to the scramble and partition of Africa. European merchants organized trade companies in various parts of Africa which later acquired charters, i.e. the right to trade and rule over the areas. The traders, in the process of establishing a peaceful atmosphere for trade, ended up colonizing Africa. When they failed to administer and meet costs, the charters were removed and hence effective occupation took place, like Abiko in Uganda and Kenya, Jiko in Tanzania, Royal Niger Company in Cameroon, Togo and Southwest Africa contributed to the colonization by the Germans. The white settlers' pressure in Africa led to the struggle for pasture and agricultural land. The whites were from different parts of Europe, hence there was need to acquire protected colonies from the respective white settlers, like Kenya Highlands for the British, Soya Belgians, Boer Transvaal and Orange Free, Britain, South Africa. Hence Africa was used to resettle the surplus population in Europe. Europe was overpopulated with limited resources, hence unemployment. Europeans were settled in Africa to acquire jobs and for settlement. From the humanitarian point of view, European missionaries came to Africa to spread Christianity. The spread of Christianity was used as a tool for colonization of Africa, i.e. that humbled Africans, especially those that were hostile. This explains why various missionary groups came to Africa, like CMS in Uganda, LMS in Iceland, Malawi, Missionaries in Fand, and Sierra Leone in Nigeria. They preached equality and brotherhood. Christianity was also used as a sign of effective occupation during the Berlin Conference of 1884–85. The humanitarians spread Western civilization in Africa, like culture, education, religion, and their aim was to eradicate African barbaric practices like slave trade, murder of twins, and polygamy. Humanitarians and Christians came from various European countries, hence represented the interests of those countries, which led to imperial rivalry in various areas, hence colonization of those areas like West and Central Africa. The humanitarians came to stop intertribal wars between the various African communities. Africa was threatened by such insecurity and hence wanted to save Africans, like between Buganda and Bunyoro, Sant and Fan, Shona and Ndebele. They promoted peace and security, which provided fertile grounds for the scramble and partition. European powers wanted to abolish slave trade and pacify Africa. To many Europeans, basing on the reports of the early travelers and explorers, the African continent was suffering from horrors of slave trade unto them. African history, European activities in Africa. Effective if political powers had been taken over, because it is the African leaders, kings and chiefs who had the monopoly of this barbaric trade, and by so doing they would in turn pacify Africa. According to the Darwinist theory of racial superiority, superior races had a duty to dominate the inferior races, and that Europe was destined to colonize Africa because of her superior race. From the strategic point of view, de Robertson, Robert and John Gallagher, a British occupation of Egypt in 1882 led to the scramble and partition of Africa. This move/event changed the history of the continent. In the first incidence, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 had shortened the sea route to India by 6 months. Because India was of great economic importance to Britain, Egypt therefore became of great strategic importance to Britain's economic interest in India. Now the issue was Britain's economic survival in India was dependent on the control of the Suez Canal. So, between 1869 and 1882, Britain struggled to acquire political as well as economic influence in Egypt to have control over the Suez Canal. This led to the Eurobis revolt against the Egyptians. In suppression of the revolt, the British occupied Egypt in 1882 at the expense of the French, who were unable to participate because they had problems at home and in Tunisia. This enabled the British to occupy the whole Nile Valley and think of painting the whole map red, as Cecil Rhodes put it. This included Uganda, Kenya and Sudan. The British wanted to protect their occupation in Egypt and also continue to exploit the Suez Canal. That is why the British and French almost went to war at Fashoda in Sudan. The British also occupied East and South Africa in order to safeguard their interests in the Indian Empire. South and East Africa were the major stations on the sea route to India, and once the British were stationed there, they would monitor easily their Indian interests. At that time, there were many Europeans interested in the area, like South Africa Dutch, Britain, Germany, Portugal, East Africa Britain, France and Germany. The British also occupied part of South and Central Africa for strategic reasons. The British need to isolate the Boers from Germany and Portugal in South Africa. The Boers were British enemies and could easily combine forces with the Germans and Portuguese to outcompete the British in South Africa, like the telegram Kaiser William sent to Paul Kruger. South Africa had gold and diamonds, and it was the work of Cecil Rhodes to see the whole area come under British control, i.e. paint it red. The struggle for the control of River Niger led to the confrontation of the French and British in Gambia, Senegal and Gambia. The Europeans at first thought that there was a connection between the Nile and Niger. River Niger was also a vital commercial area rich in palm oil gold. The clashes on River Niger led to the British to acquire Ghana and Nigeria, and the French took Senegal. During the same period, 1876–1884, Leopold XI of Belgium was busy acquiring treaties and concessions in the Congo Basin. The strategic importance of Congo Basin caused the colonization of Africa, Congo River and Intraire port, but Congo was also rich in minerals like gold, diamond and cobalt. This aroused suspicion from other imperial powers, who then struggled for territories, thus leading to the scramble and partition of Africa. The strategic position of Maghreb coastline also led to colonization. By controlling the coastline, one would be controlling the profitable trade in the Mediterranean Sea. These activities, however, should not be over-exaggerated, because annexation of African territory can be traced from as early as the opening of the 19th century, because France declared a colony over Algeria in 1830 under Charles X. Then Britain had annexed Lagos in 1860 following the bombardment of King Kasoko's palace. There were also smaller European colonies and settlements elsewhere, like the Portuguese Cabanda and Clay in the mouth of the Congo and the Boer Republic in southern Africa. In essence, therefore, the reasons for the colonization of the African continent are a matter of debate and rely more on the evidence of specific examples. Activities of men on spot led to colonization. These included missionaries, traders, and explorers who gave information about African societies. They reported about African strengths, weaknesses, nature of economies, cultures, and political setup. It was on the basis of this information that imperialists and colonialists planned their advance and methods of imposition of colonial rule, like Sir Samuel Baker. Information biased the British to use military force in Bunyoro. Lord Lugard was called Lord because of the advice he gave British Parliament on how to occupy and rule Uganda and Nigeria using the least possible resources through indirect rule. Special attention to specific causes of scramble and partition. Activities of King Leopold XI of Belgium. Leopold XI became King of Belgium in 1865. He had high appetite for colonies even before rising to throne. African history, European activities in Africa. He realized early that he could not acquire a colony in the East and then turned attention to Africa. The Belgians did not share his colonial desires, as they saw overseas colonies as wastage of resources. Historians as Betts, Oliver, Fage and Ranger view King Leopold XI's activities in Congo as the sole cause for the whole scramble and partition drama. In 1876, he formed the International African Association aimed at acquisition of colonies on the pretext of humanitarianism. He persuaded the international community to accept his claims diplomatically and through use of bribery and deceit. The colonial acquisition motive of Leopold II, however, became strong, and he gave up his humanitarian motive. This move made other European powers to view him with suspicion. It is argued that the Berlin Conference of 1884-5 was partly called to solve the suspicion problem in Congo that was threatening to burst into war, and at the Berlin Conference, the scramble for Africa was legalized, where Belgium was given a free hand in Congo Free State, main Congo. The move of assigning Congo Free State to Leopold XI ejected other powers such as France, Britain and Portugal, which had competed for Congo, to other areas of Africa. France to Congo Brazzaville, Portugal to Angola and Mozambique. Leopold XI signed treaties on which he relied to acquire Congo. He used explorers, especially H.M. Stanley, to explore and map it. H.M. Stanley carried out expeditions and signed treaties with African chiefs and established trading post stations. He later amalgamated or joined up all trading posts and established Congo Free State with himself Leopold XI as head. The treaties that H.M. Stanley signed on behalf of Leopold XI with the chiefs south of River Congo were used to secure international recognition of his claims over the Congo, particularly at the Berlin West African Conference of 1884–85. The Berlin Conference of October 1884–85. It was a diplomatic meeting that took place in Berlin under Otto von Bismarck as chairperson. It was called so because crises in West Africa, especially in Niger region, were the major issues that dominated the conference. The actual conference took place from November 15, 1884 to 30, 1885. The Berlin Act was signed on 26 February 1885. The major powers that attended the conference were France, Britain, Germany, Portugal, and Leopold XI of Belgium, who represented interests of the International African Association. Other powers represented were Austria-Hungary, Denmark, Spain, Norway, Turkey, Italy, Holland, Russia, and the United States. On the sad note, Africans were not represented at a conference that was to decide their fate. Events that led to the conference. From 1870s, the race for colonies in Africa had intensified, and as a result, Africa became a political hotbed. And West Africa Anglo-French rivalry over the Niger was bound to explode into war. In Congo, cutthroat competition between the Belgians and French was evident. The struggle between the French and the British for the control of Egypt. Thus, fearing the rivalry in Africa, Germany Chancellor Bismarck summoned a conference. Resolutions of the conference. Legalized process of abolition of slave trade, which increased European urge for colonization. Guaranteed protection of missionaries who were colonial agents and spread Christianity, which had implications on colonialism. Came up with a theory of effective occupation, which was used by colonial powers to claim territories. Legalized monopoly of trade by some European powers along coastal areas and basins like Congo Basin for African history, European activities in Africa. Confirmed British takeover of Egypt in 1882. Confirmed Leopold's takeover of Congo Free State. Changed Germans' attitude over territorial concessions and thus took over Namibia, Togo, and recognized activities of Karl Peters. Made Portuguese to occupy Angola and Mozambique as a compensation for loss of Congo Free State. Even then, France took over Congo-Brazzaville and rushed for colonies in West Africa. French activities in Central Africa and West Africa. Assessment of the Berlin Conference. The missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. Following the activities and the reports of the explorers, many European humanitarians formed philanthropic humanitarian groups with an aim of spreading Christianity to the vast sea of paganism in Africa to combat the spread of Islam at the same time. It should be noted that Islam had spread to the Maghreb region, North Africa, i.e. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. In the 19th century, there were efforts to spread Islam in Western Sudan and Somaliland, i.e. in Vardator and Futa Jalon in Chad, Sudan, and Somaliland. The East African coast had also been penetrated by Islamic influence by 1850. To the Christian world, Europe, the Islamic religion was spreading, thus the need to stop it was the driving force in the formation of missionary groups and sponsorship to do the work. Another aim of the missionary groups was to spread Western civilization. Many European nationalists believed that their civilization and culture was second to none and that it was their responsibility to spread the superior culture civilization to the less privileged in the so-called uncivilized world, Africa, Asia, and the America. The missionaries also intended to abolish slave. Reports had been made by several explorers about the untold suffering and horrors of slave trade. It's this suffering that aroused the humanitarian feelings and that stayed the abolitionist movement. Although some Afrocentric historians strongly believe that the abolitionist movements were inspired by economic factors or reasons. They argued that the abolition movement was a direct response to the Industrial Revolution, since human labor was no longer required in large quantities. In addition to the above, the missionary groups were directly or indirectly part and parcel of the colonization process. Many missionary groups flocked to Africa between 1850 and slightly before 1900. It is through their activities and the resultant outcomes that they have been regarded as the most influential European groups in colonial Africa. It is also believed that they had political hidden agenda, for they often involved themselves in the politics of many African societies, something that eventually cost the Africans their independence. In summary, objectives/aims/reasons for the coming of missionaries. They can be distinguished between religious motives, humanitarian motives, economic motives, political motives. Religious motives. Desire to drop the influence of Islam with all its bad practices. The desire to eradicate African traditional religion. African history, European activities in Africa. Humanitarian motives. The desires to abolish slave trade. The need to introduce legitimate trade. The civilizing mission. Economic motives. Through their preaching and spread of civilization, it is probable that they wanted to create market for their goods. They discouraged the use of bark cloth and encouraged use of cloth. The politic motive. They had a hidden agenda to bring about colonization. It is important to note that different missionary groups came from different European countries and belonged to different European sectors despite the fact that they all belonged to the same Christian faith. These differences mattered a lot because it is against these that their interests were molded. As one German missionary put it, "I'm a Germany first and then a missionary," i.e., he promoted the interests of his country first and then those of missionaries. Among the many missionaries and missionary groups that operated in Africa were the following: West Africa, areas countries. Nigeria 1842 West Line Mission at Badurine. The Church Missionary Society at Abioki to spread to Yoruba land. In 1857 the Niger Delta was founded under the leadership of Samuel Ajayi Crowther. In 1846 the Presbyterians founded mission at Calabar. In Sierra Leone the CMS began its work in 1806 in Baye. 1850 it had been joined by West Line missionaries who converted many Christians. In the Gold Coast Ghana the Bozo missionaries operated from 1828 onwards. The Bremen Missionary Society in 1847. Other countries of operation of missionaries in West Africa included Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cameroon and Togo. Liberia, Benin, Gambia, Senegal. Individual missionaries included Bishop Ajayi Crowther, Reverend John Scott, Henry Taunton, Thomas Freeman. African history, European activities in Africa. Individual missionaries included Alexander Mackay, Sir Goldsmith, Rev. C. T. Wilson, Father Laudel and Brother Ammons, Bishop Tucker Hannington. Central Africa. In Central Africa, the missionary revolution was significant in Nyasaland, Malawi. Following Dr. David Livingstone public addresses/lectures, many missionary groups flocked to Central Africa, and among those were the London Missionary Society, Scottish Missionary, UMCA 1860 onwards, the Paris Evangelical Mission PEM, the CMS among the Mashona and the Maybell, White and Holy Ghost Fathers. Individual missionaries included Joseph Moffat in Matib Leland, Francois Quillard in Mashonaland, Father Law in Mashona/Nyasaland, Helmore in Beloziland, Dr. David Livingstone, Bishop Mackenzie in Malawi, Bishop Tozer in Malawi, William Koji, James Sutherland. Southern Africa. In Southern Africa there was the Free Church of Scotland, the Paris Evangelical Mission among the Basuto, the Germany missionaries also operated in Namibia. The Dutch Reformed Church among the Dutch settlers. Students' research work. Write notes about missionaries in East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa and South Africa. Challenges/problems faced by missionaries in Africa. The missionaries were faced with the challenge of spreading Christianity to vast area in the shortest time possible to people that did not know how to read or write as required by their sponsors. Operating in a continent of diversity in terms of tribes or societies, cultures and traditions which made their work slow for it required determined persons to carry on. They also faced a problem of language barrier which made communication hard, and they had a challenge of learning the African languages as quickly as possible for their work to progress and to translate their work into local languages. Working among a vast sea of illiterates. The existence of other religions which were divergent and opposing to Christianity, and they included Islam. African traditional religion to mention but a few. African history, European activities in Africa. Inadequate transport and communication facilities. The only form of transport during this period was human porterage, which made the spread of their activities slow down. Operating in hostile communities where they faced opposition even in areas where they had been accepted and for various reasons, i.e. political, social and economic. The opposition was from Muslim traders, slaves, was on economic grounds, social grounds on behalf of African traditionalists, and political grounds for the existing kings. Missionary activities in Africa in eyes of many Africans as imperialists and treated equally in the same way. The wars of resistance against colonial intrusion did not spare the missionaries like the Abashiri resistance, and Mwanga's wars against the colonialists were also directly against the missionaries in East Africa. In West Africa, the Yoruba Wars, the Asante conflicts, the Tenny Mend War in Sierra Leone all involved missionaries. Securing sufficient funds to finance missionary activities. These activities required a lot of funds to establish schools, training centers, hospitals, establishing mission stations, all of which were costly. This partly explains the success of the colonial government. Lack of proper and adequate geographical knowledge about the territories in which they were to operate. This often delayed their work, as some turned out to be more of explorers than actually missionaries, e.g. Dr. David Livingstone. His impact and influence was more of an explorer than a missionary. Missionary groups who came to Africa understaffed, often comprising of 2 to 4 missionaries in a station, and in some cases they operated as individuals, e.g. Rev. Moffat of the Sea. MS operated in Maybell Land as an individual, David Livingstone of the Sea. MS was another salient example. Such small numbers could not in the task ahead of them. The factors that facilitated missionaries to carry out their activities. Vast financial resources, that is to say, they had the money to finance their activities which they secured from their home government. The approach they used to spread Christianity was human and enticing, hence enabled them to get converts more easily. their ability to break the language barrier which eased communication between the parties and understanding. They enjoyed moral and military support from their home government and even financially supported. Even Fantland Ghana/Gold Coast missionaries were supported by the British in Maitbel by the CMS. Malawian missionaries were supported by the British Chartered Company against the Ngoni. The superiority of their European doctrine against the traditional religion hence got converts in the shortest time possible, e.g., people joined the bandwagon. The advanced technology they used, e.g., military, they had arms which the African did not have and admired. The opening of the interior by building roads facilitated missionary activities, e.g., the Uganda Railway Secundi, Conakry. Political stability in some African societies enabled them to carry out their activities like the Paris Evangelical Mission in Swaziland and Southo was successful. However, the political stability in some African areas also facilitated missionary activity. When they experienced civil strife, dictatorship, slave trade, slavery, they created fertile ground for Christianity. If they saw hope in Christianity, the missionaries capitalized on these weaknesses. Internal African social weaknesses which the missionaries exploited, e.g., bad cultural beliefs, e.g., polygamy, killing of twins, human sacrifice, opportunities. Many African opportunities joined the missionaries for selfish interests, but unknowingly they promoted the missionary activities, e.g., Sir Paulo Kagwa, Seme Kakangulu. African history, European activities in Africa. Role played by missionaries in colonization of Africa. In course of missionary, humanitarian, and civilization work, they played a great role as agents of colonization in Africa. They were strong instruments towards the establishment of colonial rule in Africa, hence the assertion. The flag followed the cross, which means behind missionaries came politicians/colonizers, or missionaries came with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. As they fought ignorance, poverty, and creation of infrastructure, those were a conducive environment or atmosphere in Africa in which colonialists operated specifically, they played the following roles. They appealed for home government protection. In the name of protection, they came claiming to be protected against the African hostility, like in Central Africa resistances staged by Lobengula of Ndebele, in Uganda by Kabaka Mwanga, and religious conflicts of 1883–93 in Uganda and northern Nigeria, threats created by Islamic chiefs, etc. All of them made missionaries feel insecure in Africa. For the sake of their safety and continuation of evangelical enterprise, they appealed to their home governments for protection, which was followed by colonization of specific territories where the missionaries operated. Missionary role in signing fraudulent treaties. Missionary role in interpretation and propaganda contributed towards the colonization of Africa, like the role played by Bishop Tucker as an interpreter in the signing of the Uganda Agreement. It is against this background that Sir Harry Johnston, a British representative in signing of the Uganda Agreement. Missionaries like Reverend Moffat in Central was also instrumental in securing their treaties for British government should not be left out. They involved in African politics, like supporting one group against the others, hence creating puppet leaders. It is only Menelik XI of Ethiopia who refused to sign the Italian version and survived colonial rule. Missionaries participated in the intensive exploration of Africa, which improved European knowledge about the continent. Krapf, Ribman, and Livingstone, the pioneer missionaries in Africa, got heavily involved in the exploration exercise. There is no doubt that the travels of David Livingstone in East and Central Africa raised the European curiosity in the area. The reports of Krapf, Ribman, and Erhard Chu led to the exploration of East Africa. The struggle to discover the source of the most important river was partly as a result of missionary activity, like Livingstone's assertion that the Zambezi was God's highway to the interior granted an insatiable curiosity about the Nile and the Congo. Missionaries were also instrumental in the development of a cash crop economy, legitimate trade wherever they went. In a bid to provide an alternative to slave trade, missionaries engaged in pilot attempts in cash crop production, which in turn formed the basis for an export-import economy of Uganda. The crops produced were to remain key foreign exchange earners, though at the same time their production turned Africa into a raw material producing ground to imperial Europe and confined Africans to the land and not politics. And also due to the promotion of legitimate trade, in process the missionaries paved way for the coming of their home traders, who later formed trading companies and played an important role in the colonization of Africa. Through their evangelization missions, missionaries attacked and condemned African culture and customs as barbaric and satanic practices like polygamy, witchcraft, female circumcision, throwing away of twins, and deliberately sought reforms in African society, and this made the Africans to believe that European institutions were better. The reforms eventually led to a decline in the influence of African traditional religion. Shrines were replaced by churches, while traditional leaders gave way for church priests and clergy. As a result, the individual Africans who became a Christian saw the reason for the existence in his or her relationship to God rather than to his or her family, clan, or ethnic group. Also, resisting a missionary, or any European for that matter, was considered being anti-progress, and this weakened the African spirit of resistance, making things easy for colonialists. Missionary education created a class of Africans who served as an efficient instrument in the establishment of colonial rule. Like in Central Africa, Chief Lewanika had obtained some education from the schools, Seme, Kakangulu in East Africa, who colonized eastern Uganda not for missionary but for colonialists, were all products of those missionary schools like Bishop Ajayi Crowther. Closely related to the above, missionary education system was responsible for a linguistic revolution in Africa. The products of missionary education would speak and write English, French, German, Dutch, and their own local languages. The study of languages removed the language barrier which would have disturbed the establishment of colonial rule. African history, European activities in Africa. These powers would be challenged. A case in point is Mwanga, the king of Buganda, whose authority was partly derived from his religious cultural functions. The coming of Christian missionaries in Buganda brought a division of loyalties between the Kabaka and the new faith. This created a group of Baganda that were ready to challenge the Kabaka and welcome colonization. Missionaries were involved in trade, and some missionary groups formed trading groups such as the Basel Trading Company, which was formed by the Basel Missionary Group in Ghana. In most cases, the missionaries and the traders could not easily be distinguished because they were similar in color, language, and carried out similar activities. Missionaries of a given country excluded traders of other countries and welcomed traders of their even countries to establish trade monopolies which colonization later came to protect. They were also development of formal education in Africa, something the Europeans were less interested in. Providing to Africans, in Kenya for instance, Alliance High was formed. In Uganda, Protestant missionaries established Mengo SS, King's College Bado, while the Catholics put up SMAC and Namuyano College for their converts. In the end, the education missionaries introduced ideological wings of imperialism and trained people to play subordinate roles during colonial rule that is mostly being houseboys/girls and clerks. Missionaries were forerunners of imperialism. They consciously or unconsciously facilitated infringement of colonial rule in Africa. In this role, missionaries facilitated the drawing of spheres of influence in their metropolitan governments. They'd also formed chartered companies like the Ida Company, DEA Company, CMS, where they also acted as the foot. Through their policy of conversion to Christianity, they embarked on intensive preaching and spreading of the gospel of Christ to the heathen. As a result, missionaries won supporters to constitute a new order, a new set of civilization, a new social outlook. In final analysis, the Christian's cross became an intimate bedfellow of the national flag by which Africa was then conquered. Closely linked to the above was the way missionaries spread their gospel, where there were two religions, i.e. Protestants and Catholic missionaries, who divided Africans on religious grounds, and so by the time of colonization, it paved easy because the Africans were divided and could not easily fight back to the missionaries or colonialists. This weakened the African unity, and so could not fight the common enemy. Religious divisionism, African resistance against colonialism, was further weakened by disunity caused by religious factions. Like in Buganda in 1883–93, there were religious wars between the Muslims, Protestants, Wanjeleza Wafaransa wars, which led to a lot of instability, and by the coming of colonialists into Buganda, the Ugandan natives could not unite against them because of these religious divisions. The missionaries aimed at stopping slave trade, and this necessitated uprooting it from the interior. This increased European penetration in Africa, and in so doing, Africa was open to European influence and later colonization. They established the original social and economic infrastructure which enabled colonialists to penetrate the interior with ease. These economic infrastructures, like roads, also facilitated the spread of colonial rule and colonization of Africa. Missionaries also pacified Africans. Those who embraced Christianity saw the white man as a good person, a judgment based on the hypocritical conduct of the missionaries. In some cases, the missionaries treated Africans or offered material goods like clothes, shoes, mirrors, and guns. Every white man was then considered as God as a missionary and would therefore be welcome. This definitely facilitated colonization. African history, European activities in Africa. They improved the health sector through discovery of medicine like quinine and establishment of healthy centers. In Central Africa by the Livingstone Mission at Malawi, Lovedale Mission, in East Africa Mulego, Mengo, etc. They improved the education sector through establishment of schools. In Central Africa, Overtown School, Muir, Mwida by Livingstone in Mission near Mantry Falls, in West Africa, Forbay College, St. Gregory and Walsh Institute. They also established mission stations. In Central Africa, in Lozi Kingdom, south of Lake Nyasa by Umka, at Bruman by Reverend Moffat, and at Colobrio in East Africa, Bagamoyo and Ujiji. They introduced and encouraged the growing of new crops and use of new methods of farming like cocoa, palm oil, groundnuts, cotton, rubber. They established modern transport and communication network like roads, railways, ports and harbours, telegraph lines. They introduced informal education that taught reading, writing, arithmetic. The education system also produced African elites that aided imperialism like Seme Kakangulu. They checked on the spread of Islam in Africa, especially West and East Africa. Promoted African languages like Yoruba, Igbo, Kru, Tani, Man, Creoles, Ngoni, Yao. Fought against slave trade and introduced legitimate trade. They supplied European manufactured goods. They provided employment to Africans as teachers, nurses, interpreters, secretaries, which increased standard of living. They promoted urbanization in West Africa like Freetown, Abeokuta, Lagos, Accra, led to emergency of independent churches, established freed slave centers like in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Negative contributions led to colonization of Africa, involved in African politics and antagonized African political fabric. The campaigned African traditional religion, led to religious wars. The education provided aided colonial administration, neglected African technology like use of verbs/vocational. African history, European activities in Africa. 1868 Mutasa 1 Kasagama of Toro. There were those that accepted genuinely and were converted like Kama of the Ingwata who had 200 wives, dismissed all of them and remained with one. Some societies accepted in order to preserve their independence against African local enemies like the Fant who feared Asante imperialism, Boer imperialism and freed slaves, Baganda, etc. Other people admired Western culture of civilization like Kama of Ingwata, Fant, Baganda, etc. Opportunism, i.e. people who wanted to exploit Christianity for their own benefit like Semikakangulu and Sir Apollo Kagwa. Natural calamities which had hit them and hoped to use missionaries to overcome their economic hardships like Massa who had been hit by a Rhinderpest epidemics. Negative response. Fear alarmed by the presence of those missionaries that their presence had the potential to disrupt their political and social order like Georgia of Apobo, the Asante, Baniora and others had strong attachment to traditional belief and cultures like missionaries appeared as devils because of their colour like among the Nandi and Yoruba. Loss of political independence more especially among the Sabbat and Jebel rulers. Others, particularly African leaders, were hesitant to accept Christianity because they feared to lose their prestige among their subordinates with prestige was based on African beliefs and values, yet preaching of Christianity centered on undermining African values like many African leaders were not converted. They desired to resist the abolition of slavery by slave trading communities. They rejected Christianity for fear of loss of their economic livelihood, e.g. the Yao and Ngorani slaves in East Africa. The influence of Islamic communities and people who had been Islamic considered Christianity and Christians as infidels. While some accepted because of natural calamities, others resented missionaries because they attributed the natural calamities to the coming of the missionaries. Some were politically/militarily strong, hence did not want any assistance like Georgia of Apobo, Asante, and Banyora. Traditional beliefs and interpretations, i.e. they believed that the colour of the whites was for demons like Uganda, Nandi, Yoruba people. Fear to disrupt social order like small gods of Musuk, Lubeo, Mukasa among others. Fear to lose prestige, where they did not want to lose fame among their natives and subordinates for they could not start criticizing them. Fear for European intrusion whereby they knew that if the Europeans came in, they would destroy their African